It's the Ricochet Podcast with Peter Robinson and Rob Long. I'm James Lilacs, and today we talk to Harmeet Dhillon about suing Twitter. So let's have ourselves a podcast.
My friend Harmeet Dhillon. Harmeet grew up in the American South. She attended Dartmouth College, an institution close to my heart, where she was editor of the Dartmouth Review. I recognize it's a small world, but if you are in the Dartmouth world, it's just going to be hard for anybody to follow the act of being editor of the Dartmouth Review. Harmeet has done so. UVA Law School. She's now here in California. She is a champion of causes that other people are willing to give up as lost, including the California Republican Party. More to the point, she has founded her own law firm, and in recent months, she has just filed a suit against Twitter. We'll come to that in a moment, but in recent months, she has participated in 3 suits against the state of California's lockdown that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that she won. Harmeet, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I've been a listener and a fan of this podcast.
Thank you. All right. You're on with Rob Long and James Lilacs, who they'll put their elbows out and come crowding in at any moment. So let me just get it going. Can you describe why sue the state of California? And why not just wait for the COVID thing to end, it won't be in weeks, but it will be in months. You took them to court. How come?
Well, I'm a person of faith and a fighter for the First Amendment my entire 28 years as an attorney. And to me, there's no more precious right in this country than the right to be able to worship without government interference. But along the way, I should add, I sued the state a dozen times for a number of other things. The state violated the state constitution by closing the beaches of Orange County. They also banned protest at the Capitol. They also, with no due process, shut down small businesses while allowing large businesses to thrive throughout this pandemic. And they basically made a mockery of any of the guardrails that normally cabin and govern the actions of the government vis-a-vis our fundamental rights. And so as a person who lives here, despite all of the trials and tribulations like you do, Peter, this is unacceptable. There's really no reason to live in California if we enjoy none of our rights. And so I live here. I chose to fight for those rights, and very gratified that the victory you had on last week in the United States Supreme Court is being viewed.
Can you describe the facts in that case and
Yes.
what the court decided?
So among the many things the state did from the beginning was say that religious worship could only be virtual. We, through court challenges, knocked that down. They imposed 25% caps. That was knocked down. And they said people cannot gather in homes to do Bible study or other worship of 3 families or more, while at the same time, people are, of course, free to do that in many other settings. United States Supreme Court applied strict scrutiny to the imposition of restrictions on the worship in homes. And previously, the right to be free from government interference in your religious worship has enjoyed a second-class status under First Amendment jurisprudence ever since the famous Peyote case that Justice Scalia, of all people, authored and basically downgraded the religious rights in the bundle of First Amendment rights. Commentators are viewing Friday's decision, where the court very decisively scolded the state for this discriminatory behavior and applied strict scrutiny to knock down this restriction, as a sea change, elevating that right of religious freedom back into the primary tier of First Amendment rights in our country. So it's a huge decision.
So you not only achieved a victory in that case, you achieved a landmark in jurisprudence that will affect the whole country.
I hope so. I mean, it is a shadow docket decision. In other words, it is the state, it is the Supreme Court granting an injunction pending full review.
Okay.
But
Rob,
it was in a 9-hour span between the time the government put its papers in, the United States Supreme Court slapped them down very brutally. And so we have high hopes that this is going to be applied to other decisions as well.
Warms the lawyer's heart. I have one more question before handing it off to Rob, who wants to come in. He's sending me texts. So you'll come in a moment, Rob. When you go, California has done all the things that you said it has done, including there was a long period of time when at my church, we had to have mass outdoors, and then Harmeet wanted the Supreme Court and we could go back inside the church. Was California under the pressure of COVID and trying to act and figure out what it should do in this circumstance, taking advice from all the, what we have, 52 counties, 52 different health officers. Were they just bungling? Or was there real malice, or malice is a word with a legal definition? Was there ill will toward people of faith on the part of the bureaucracy in Sacramento? What did you feel yourself up against?
Well, so first of all, when the announcement came that California was going to shut down, I, like other responsible business owners, I employ a dozen people here in this office. We shut down our office. We didn't complain. We went to our homes, or our weekend homes, as some of us have, and we, sat it out, hoping we were going to be able to get back to the office. When the government started posting its restrictions, and we saw immediately that these different tiers were being made up with no scientific basis, we began to realize that they were winging it. Again, cut them a little slack. But I think there is what the left would call an unconscious bias against religion. And that made it okay for the governor, who claims he's a person of faith, to say you can worship by Zoom, without addressing the fact that this is a large state with a large rural population. There is no effective internet in parts of our state. I know that because I live on the weekends in a rural area. And so this immediately relegated faith to a subservient position. And he persisted despite numerous lawsuits and 5 losses in the United States Supreme Court. It is only a grudging response to say, now we're going to eliminate our restrictions. So at first I thought it was simply fumbling and an unconscious bias, but when you repeatedly refuse court orders and you repeatedly refuse to get the message, it becomes deliberate and it becomes deeply offensive. And that is why in the later versions of lawsuits, including our lawsuit to open up the schools in California, many Democrats were among the plaintiffs in those cases. I'm co-counsel with Mark Garagos, who's a liberal in many of these cases. And this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue of whether you believe in the First Amendment, whether you believe in fundamental rights and due process, or whether you think the government is paramount and we derive our rights from the government as opposed to, under natural law, from God.
Got it. Rob?
Hey, Harmeet, thanks for joining us. But all that happened really fast. I mean, to me, right? A year ago, we would never have imagined that. I mean, I live in New York City. I live in New York. I would never have imagined that the governor would have just arrogated these powers to himself, and without, we were all kind of an emergency. I guess we just let it happen. Same thing with Governor Newsom, I think. Isn't that sort of? So I guess what I'm saying is I understand it. I understand when you go to court and challenge a ruling or a law or a regulation imposed by the governor, a governor. But isn't the other battle you're fighting against the kind of forgetfulness that people have and the kind of willingness they have to sort of shrug and say, "Oh, okay, I'll wear 6 masks. Oh, okay, they're going to close the school. Okay." I mean, I don't think people are storming the barricades.
No, not at all.
I'm not sure that's a good thing. Maybe they should be.
Well, I think you're right that over time we have become conditioned as the government grows, as we have the Department of Education, Department of everything, like non-doctors dictating medical outcomes affecting in Los Angeles County, 10 million people. The health department person there is not a doctor. She has more power than the potentates of third world countries and states in the United States. And so we have come culturally for decades to accept government playing a overweening place in our lives. And the United States Supreme Court, before I won 3 times, we lost many times, and we lost with Justice Roberts and others authoring opinions saying, "Oh, there's a pandemic. The government uttered the P word, and the government gets to do whatever it wants."
Right.
Federal judge after federal judge cited a 1903 opinion, Jacobson versus Massachusetts, maybe 1905, that predates all of the tiered scrutiny that the courts have built up, and just said, "Oh, there's a pandemic. The government has emergency powers and they can do whatever they want." I think it's shocking that left and right forces in this country simply sat aside and said we should trust the government. We should trust the science, as if the science is some kind of a mantra that is fixed in time and that doesn't evolve. I studied science. I was actually pre-med at Dartmouth before I went into majoring in the classics. And so I know some science. I've dissected frogs and deer and done experiments. So and my father is a doctor. Both my grandfathers were doctors. And I don't venerate what Dr. Fauci says on one given day when he changes it a few days later. So there has been a collective suspension of our normal critical thinking in this crisis that I hope is not a one-way ratchet. I think that we did wake some people up by fighting, but it was a lonely battle for many months.
I think you're right. I think you did wake some people up. I mean, just on a practical level, your argument for the churches, I mean, that's let's just be honest. Church going is a theoretical issue to the majority of Americans at this point. The majority don't go to church. So we're using church going and church closings as a kind of a canary in a coal mine. When they came for the churchgoers, I said nothing. It does seem like we've arrogated enormous, or not arrogated. We've ceded an enormous amount of our own sort of sovereignty to an unelected bureaucratic class who are basically doing what they're supposed to be doing. I mean, Dr. Fauci is kind of doing what you want the chief medical officer of the country to do, which is to say, everybody stay home because it's dangerous out there. But we don't seem to have reclaimed our own personal responsibility and personal risk and risk appetite.
Well,
do you see that changing?
No.
Well, look, what I see here, I mean, of course, California is somewhat of a unique situation because it is a one-party state. But even in a one-party state, obviously you have the doctors, they can urge the caution. What you expect to have is the government then balancing the risks and the rewards.
Right.
You didn't have that. Our one-party state in California had no debate in the legislature. Even the Democrat legislators were happy to have the governor take the fall for shutting down the schools, shutting down the businesses, shutting down the churches, shutting down protests, even shutting the beaches, which has zero scientific basis. It was purely punitive. So there was no accountability because we have a one-party state. New York is somewhat less so, but you still have this perfect storm of fear, sort of creeping authoritarianism and the administrative state. And then you have Americans, frankly, conservatives have been on the wrong side of many civil rights issues over the years. I was on the board of the American Civil Liberties Union here in Northern California for 2 years after 9/11. And I've gotten nothing but hate from Republicans over the years for that. But if you don't stand up and fight for your fundamental rights, whether it's the other guy's rights or your rights, you find yourself in this position where you can't send your children, even if you're rich and you have a private school, you can't send them to that school, and you basically have no rights. And so I find this to be a watershed moment in United States civil rights and governance. And we're turning the tide, but man, losing the string of cases that I lost to get there, it was pretty humiliating for a relatively successful lawyer to do that, but it was worth it in the end.
Let's talk about the case we hope you win. You're suing Twitter for banning James O'Keefe. Now, of course, everybody knows that Veritas is guilty of chopping up their videos and making everybody look bad through deceptive editing, even though, of course, he'll release the entire 2-hour tape so you can judge for yourself. But that's the thing on him. He's a criminal, he's convicted, and he lies. So a lot of people are just shrugging and saying, good that Twitter's kicking him off because he's a source of disinformation. I assume your position is otherwise. Tell us why you're suing them and on what basis and whether or not you think you're going to win.
Sure. Well, the lawsuit's going to be filed, not today, but, sometime in the next few days. And the basis is defamation. They did not merely bounce him off of the platform, but they said false things about him to their allies in the media who immediately published those false things on Twitter where he had no ability to respond. Specifically, they said James was removed from the platform for utilizing fake accounts and for using fake accounts to amplify and manipulate algorithms or conversations on Twitter. And James says he does not do those things. And so, you could remove somebody, and I've sued Twitter unsuccessfully here in California on behalf of what she would call herself a radical feminist who was critical of transgender activists on Twitter. And the California court and the Court of Appeals ruled that the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, lets Twitter do whatever it wants on the platform. I disagree with that, but until we have some Republican legislators with some guts, that is going to stand as the law there. However, this is a totally different issue. This is whether Twitter has the right to bounce people off and then say false things about them. We don't think they have that right. And that's really, it's pretty simple. That's the basis of it.
That is a novel approach, because it seems to be that a lot of conservatives would just say, well, private company, they can do what they want. If they want to ban anybody from criticizing the transgender movement, they can do it. Go build your own. But let's look at that go build your own argument. It's a little bit more complex than that, isn't it?
Well,
Um,
absolutely. Go build. First of all, they can ban anybody they want is itself false premise, because every user of Twitter or any of these platforms, Ricochet, you enter into a contract that governs the terms of service and your conduct. And in Twitter's case, they enumerate types of behavior that will get you removed. The type of behavior that got my client removed was not part of their terms of service. They changed the terms of service retroactively, which is appalling. And the court said we're not going to even bother to look at contract law or tort law when it comes to these big tech companies. And yes, you're correct. The sort of conservative establishment and libertarian world has said, oh, they can do whatever they want. But when they try to do whatever they want, Exhibit A is Parler, and there are other examples, a cartel of big tech companies that do the hosting simply exclude them. So IBM has kicked them off, Amazon Cloud Services kicked them off. And so it now becomes impossible when you allow this type of a cartel to dominate information technology in our world for any other alternative voices to occur. And imagine this, the governor of California says you may only worship through digital means. Those digital means churches have been using have included Facebook Live and others. And so if you aren't able to participate in society through one of these software platforms, which I don't think you should be forced to use if you don't want to, you have no ability to communicate with others. Coming next, and this is not a far-fetched scenario, I have had to represent nonprofits in California that have had their right to use MasterCard, their right to have payments processed through Stripe
right.
platform.
Right.
They've had that taken away. If you can't use money, you can't speak. What if Verizon decides Harmeet Dhillon is dangerous with all of her Supreme Court victories? We don't want her to have a phone with us. And then what is a libertarian world going to say? LOL, build your own phone company? I mean, this is not practical.
Right. They will say that actually you can, that if you're kicked off the phone, then you should get two tin cans and string a couple of miles of wire and communicate that way. No, you're absolutely right. It is worrisome. And partially when you say the Twitter changed the terms of services, everybody who logs onto these things periodically gets an update, which you just accept, right? Because they're constantly under the hood changing things and updating and the rest of it. And nobody has any conception of what they ever signed on to. If you really want to do something, if you want to do something else after you've had your string of legal victories for the next year, do something about the end user license agreement language and length. Just somehow find a way to reduce that down to 4 or 5 simple little statements that people can understand and require it to be an opt-in as opposed to just automatically just doing whatever you happen to do to continue on with your day on the internet. Well, Rob, Peter, additional questions? I know we can go forever.
Could I go back?
You've taken up a lot of our time.
Could I go? Last question for you, Harmeet. And thank you for joining us. To go back to Rob's question. So you've been appearing a lot on Fox News. You've now got some grudgingly favorable press because you're winning victories. You're doing significant things. Do you feel in the comments you get on Twitter and the things people say to you around town in San Francisco, do you feel that people are saying, yeah, we need to do this? Or are you fighting a battle do you feel the tide of the momentum in the battle turning in our favor, in the favor of reclaiming individual rights and putting government back in its box? Or do you feel you're fighting a glorious but slowly losing cause?
Well, I don't believe it's a slowly losing cause. If I thought that, I wouldn't be doing it. It would be too hopeless. I would spend my time knitting and, doing stuff that makes me money. None of this stuff makes me money, au contraire. But how people respond depends on whether they have liberty. Is their name on the door of their business? Those people are free to communicate with me. If they are working for a big tech company, dating back to my lawsuit against Google for James Damore and others, we have found that people are not free if they work for big corporations to express heterodox views in our society. California is particularly acute, but now we have seen this culture come to Georgia and other states where standing up for one man, one vote equals some sort of Jim Crow tyranny, which is of course absurd. So I think we are definitely in an area of censorship, corporate censorship. I frankly think under the Biden administration, corporations are being used to deploy policies that would not pass in the legislature. That's a very dangerous development since most of these corporations derive more of their revenue from foreign sources, like in China and India and third world countries, than they do the United States. So the shareholders and profits are going to dictate policies being imposed on Americans, including speech policies, access to services, and of course, voting rights. This is terrifying, and all Americans should be concerned about this, whether they're left or right, because one day the corporations abroad or their interests abroad may dictate some type of fascism here in this country that we don't want. So we have to stand up for these rights.
Did Google require James Damore to be put in a bathysphere and dropped to the bottom of the Marianas Trench so that his mere existence on Earth did not cause harm, or is he still walking around as a free man?
He's walking around as a free man, but certainly people like me and like him who express these types of views. I get death threats. I get a lot of hate on social media, and I guess I signed up for it dating back to Dartmouth days. I was very controversial then, but your James Damore of the world doesn't. And so he still works in this country. He still has a job, but Google turned him from a brilliant person earning a high salary into somebody who is a constant target of threats and abuse. And
well,
so
as
unfortunate.
the Twitter mob calls it, that's just accountability. Oy.
That's right.
Harmeet, thanks for joining us today, and we hope to have you on again after the successful conclusion of your battle with Twitter.
Well, fingers
Good luck.
crossed. Thank you.
Thanks, Harmeet.
Bye.
Thanks, Harmeet.